The summer heat in Orlando, Florida hung heavy in the air as Cindy Anthony paced back and forth in her living room. It had been 31 days since she had seen her granddaughter Kaylee, a bright-eyed 2-year-old with a winning smile. Cindy's daughter Casey, Kaylee's mother, had given different stories about where the child was. First, she said Kaylee was with a nanny. Then she claimed the little girl was on a trip with friends. Each passing day brought more worry. On July 15, 2008, Cindy finally broke. She found Casey's car abandoned in a parking lot. When she opened the door, a terrible smell hit her, something dark and rotten, something that reminded her of death. That same day, Cindy made a call that would launch one of the most followed criminal cases in American history. "I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car," Cindy told the 911 operator, her voice shaking with fear and anger. Hours later, she made another call. "I've called 3 times to report a missing child. My granddaughter has been missing for a month." When police questioned Casey Anthony, they found a young woman who didn't act like a worried mother. While her daughter had been missing for a month, Casey hadn't called the police. Instead, she had been going to nightclubs, shopping, and staying with her new boyfriend. Pictures showed her smiling and partying during the time. Kaylee was nowhere to be found. "Kaylee is with her nanny, Zenaida Gonzalez," Casey told detectives, her face blank and her voice steady. "Zanny the nanny, that's what we call her." She gave police an address where this nanny supposedly lived. But when detectives checked, they found the apartment had been empty for months. No one named Zenaida Gonzalez had ever lived there. More lies followed. Casey claimed she worked at Universal Studios and even walked detectives through the theme park offices before finally admitting she had been fired years earlier. Casey's behavior confused everyone. Her friends said she had been a loving mother to Kaylee. Videos and pictures showed them playing together, laughing, and sharing tender moments. But now Casey seemed cold, distant, and more worried about herself than her missing daughter. On July 16, just one day after Kaylee was reported missing, police arrested Casey for child neglect, making false statements, and obstructing an investigation. As she sat in jail, the search for little Kaylee grew. Volunteers combed through woods and fields around Orlando. Kaylee's face appeared on television screens across America. People who had never met the Anthony family felt drawn into the case, checking news updates and hoping the little girl would be found alive. Meanwhile, forensic teams examined Casey's car. The trunk contained a hair that matched Kaylee's DNA. Tests showed traces of chloroform, a chemical that can knock people unconscious. Computer records from the Anthony home revealed searches for how to make chloroform and neck breaking. Cindy and George Anthony, Casey's parents, struggled to make sense of what was happening. One moment, they defended their daughter in front of news cameras, the next they questioned her stories in private. George, a former police officer, knew the evidence was pointing in a terrible direction. As summer turned to fall, hope for finding Kaylee alive dimmed. Casey remained in jail, writing letters and making phone calls that showed little concern for her daughter. Instead, she complained about jail conditions and talked about plans for when she got out. The nation watched in disbelief. How could a mother not report her child missing for a month? What had happened to the smiling toddler in the photos? And most importantly, where was Kaylee Anthony? The answers, when they would finally come, would shock America and divide public opinion for years to come. As the days turned into weeks, the search for little Kaylee Anthony grew more intense. People across Orlando joined police teams, walking through woods, checking empty lots, and passing out flyers with the toddler's smiling face. Television news showed these searches every night, and across America, people who had never met the Anthony family followed the case closely. In the orange-walled interview room at the police station, detectives watched Casey Anthony closely. Most parents of missing children cried, begged for help, or showed deep worry. Casey did none of these things. She sat calmly, sometimes smiled, and told stories that kept falling apart when checked. "We know you're lying, Casey," Detective Yuri Melich told her during one long interview. "The nanny doesn't exist. Your job doesn't exist. What happened to Kaylee?" Casey looked at him with steady eyes. "I'm telling you the truth. Zenaida took her." But the police found more problems with Casey's story each day. The friends Casey claimed were watching Kaylee had never seen the child. Casey's cell phone records showed she was nowhere near the places she claimed to be when Kaylee disappeared, and most troubling, her car trunk had evidence that pointed to death. In the jail, Casey wrote letters to another prisoner. "I hope you're coming home soon. I'm not doing so well," she wrote. "Everyone wants to talk about the case, but I can't. I know in my heart I'm innocent of what they're saying." Not once in her letters did she ask for help finding Kaylee or express fear for her daughter's safety. Meanwhile, Casey's parents, George and Cindy Anthony, faced reporters outside their home almost daily. Their faces showed the strain of living in two terrible worlds, wanting to believe their daughter while fearing the worst for their granddaughter. "I know my daughter has her problems," Cindy said during one tearful interview, "but she would never hurt Kaylee, never." In August, new evidence came to light. Casey's computer showed searches for foolproof suffocation and how to make chloroform. Her cell phone had been near the Anthony home, not at work as she claimed on the day Kaylee was last seen. And most damning, air samples from her car trunk matched the smell of human decomposition. "We have a case that's beginning to look like murder," the prosecutor told the judge when asking to keep Casey in jail. The judge agreed, and Casey remained behind bars as summer turned to fall. Outside the jail, public anger toward Casey grew. When she appeared in court for hearings, people lined the streets with signs calling her a killer. News shows debated her guilt each night. Child welfare experts tried to understand how a seemingly loving mother could act so coldly about her missing child. In October, the state charged Casey with murder. The evidence, while strong, was mostly circumstantial. There was no body, no confession, and no eyewitnesses. But prosecutors felt they had enough to prove Casey had killed Kaylee, perhaps using chloroform to make her sleep before suffocating her. Casey's new defense lawyer, Joseph Bays, fought back hard. "The state has no case," he told reporters. "They have no body, no cause of death, nothing but speculation. Casey is innocent and we will prove it." Through all this, the biggest question remained unanswered. Where was Kaylee? Had someone taken her as Casey claimed? Was she hidden somewhere, alive or dead? The not knowing haunted everyone following the case. Then, in December 2008, nearly 6 months after Kaylee was last seen, a meter reader named Roy Kronk was working in a wooded area less than half a mile from the Anthony home. He spotted something unusual in the underbrush, a plastic bag. Inside was what looked like a small skull. The search for Kaylee Anthony was about to take its darkest turn. The skull found by meter reader Roy Kronk brought both closure and new questions to the Kaylee Anthony case. Police sealed off the wooded area near the Anthony home, setting up white tents to protect the scene from December rain and curious onlookers. Forensic teams worked slowly, on hands and knees, gathering tiny bones scattered by animals in time. "It's her. It's Kaylee," Cindy Anthony cried when police came to tell the family. George held his sobbing wife while officers explained what they had found. A small skull. Duct tape where the mouth had been. Bones in a laundry bag and plastic trash bags, thrown into swampy woods like garbage. In her jail cell, Casey showed little reaction when told about the discovery. Guards reported she seemed more interested in a magazine she was reading than news about her daughter's remains. This cold behavior only strengthened public anger toward her. Outside the jail, people held candles and left teddy bears for Kaylee, while shouting hateful words about Casey. The medical examiner worked for days examining the small bones. Kaylee's death was ruled a homicide, but the exact cause couldn't be determined. The duct tape suggested suffocation. Plant material showed the body had been in the woods for months, since June or July. A heart-shaped sticker had been placed on the duct tape, a strange and chilling detail. When the remains were identified as Kaylee's through DNA tests, prosecutors felt their case growing stronger. The location of the body, so close to the Anthony home, contradicted Casey's story about a nanny taking Kaylee. The duct tape matched a roll found in the Anthony garage. The laundry bag looked just like ones the family used. "We will seek the death penalty," the prosecutor announced. If convicted, Casey Anthony could become one of the few women on Florida's death row. The charges were severe: first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter, and 4 counts of lying to police. Casey's defense team worked to counter the growing evidence. They suggested the meter reader had moved the body, pointing out that Kronk had called police about something in the same area months earlier. They questioned the forensic evidence, bringing in their own experts to review findings. Most importantly, they began building a very different story about what happened to Kaylee. This case is about a tragic accident, defense attorney Joseph Baez told reporters. It's about a family with dark secrets. He hinted that when the truth came out at trial, people would see Casey very differently. The months that followed brought intense media coverage. Television shows analyzed every detail of the case. Books were written. Everyone had an opinion about Casey Anthony, and most believed she was guilty. Her face appeared on magazine covers with headlines like Monster Mom and Justice for Kaylee. In jail, Casey received hundreds of angry letters from strangers. For the Anthony family, life became almost unbearable. Reporters camped outside their home. Neighbors complained about the constant traffic. Rumors spread that George and Cindy were fighting over whether to stand by their daughter. Their pain played out on national television. In April 2009, prosecutors released thousands of pages of evidence, including Casey's jail letters and phone calls. In them, she rarely mentioned Kaylee, focusing instead on her own problems. "I've been here for 6 months," she complained to her mother. "I want to come home." When Cindy tried to ask about Kaylee, Casey changed the subject. As the trial date approached, both sides prepared for what would become one of the most watched court cases in American history. The prosecution had science, air samples, DNA, duct tape, computer searches. The defense had a surprising story they promised would explain everything. At the center of it all was Casey Anthony, who sat in her cell writing letters, sometimes smiling for the cameras in court, showing little grief for her daughter found in the woods like discarded trash. The trial of Casey Anthony began on May 24, 2011, in a packed Orlando courtroom. Outside, people waited overnight for seats to watch in person. Millions more followed on television, where every network showed the proceedings live. Judge Belvin Perry, known for his strict courtroom control, looked out at the crowd with stern eyes. The defendant, Casey Anthony, killed her daughter, prosecutor Jeff Ashton said in his opening statement. His voice was calm, but his words hit hard. He described how Casey used chloroform to knock Kaylee unconscious, put duct tape over her nose and mouth, and then stored her body in the car trunk before dumping it in the woods. She went to nightclubs. She got a tattoo saying Bella Vita, beautiful life, while her daughter lay dead. Then defense attorney Joseph Baez stood up. What he said next stunned the courtroom. Kaylee Anthony was never missing. She drowned in the family pool on June 16, 2008. Gasps filled the room. And when Casey found her daughter, she ran to her father. George Anthony, a former police officer, told his daughter, "Look what you've done." He helped cover up the accident to make it look like murder. Baez wasn't finished with his shocking claims. The reason Casey acted so normally after her daughter's death is that she had been trained to hide her pain. He claimed George Anthony had sexually abused Casey since she was 8 years old, teaching her to act like nothing was wrong. This is why Casey lied. She'd been lying her whole life to hide her shame. George Anthony, sitting in the courtroom, shook his head in anger and disbelief. Day after day, the prosecution built their case. They showed pictures of Casey partying during the 31 days Kaylee was missing. They brought in scientific experts who testified about the smell of death in Casey's car trunk. Computer analysts showed searches for neck breaking and chloroform on the Anthony home computer. Casey's friends testified she had seemed normal during the time Kaylee was gone. "She never mentioned Kaylee was missing," said one. "She said Kaylee was with the nanny and seemed happy." The most powerful testimony came from Casey's mother, Cindy. She cried while looking at pictures of Kaylee, but also tried to help her daughter by claiming she had made the computer searches for chloroform herself. The prosecution quickly proved this was impossible, as Cindy had been at work when the searches were made. George Anthony firmly denied abusing Casey or helping cover up Kaylee's death. "I would never do anything to harm my granddaughter," he said, his voice breaking, "or help hide her body. These accusations are not true." As weeks passed, the scientific evidence became the focus. Experts argued about air samples from Casey's car trunk. The prosecution said they showed human decomposition. The defense brought their own experts who said the tests were unreliable. The jury saw pictures of Kaylee's skull with duct tape where the mouth would have been. Prosecutors said this proved murder. Defense experts argued the tape could have been moved by animals after death. Through it all, Casey Anthony sat at the defense table, sometimes crying, sometimes writing notes, sometimes whispering to her lawyers. She never took the stand to testify, which meant she never had to answer questions about her conflicting stories or explain her behavior after Kaylee's death. After 33 days of testimony, 400 pieces of evidence, and 91 witnesses, the case went to the jury on July 4, 2011. Remember, prosecutor Jeff Ashton told them in his closing argument, "Common sense tells you no accident is covered up with duct tape." The jury of 7 women and 5 men left to decide if Casey Anthony was a murderer who deserved death, or a troubled young woman caught in a tragic accident and web of lies. Outside, a nation waited for their answer. After only 11 hours of thinking about all the evidence, the jury in the Casey Anthony trial reached their decision. This was shockingly fast for a murder case that could end with a death sentence. On July 5, 2011, they came back to the courtroom ready to share their verdict with the world. The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Belvin Perry read the paper handed to him by the jury foreman. Casey Anthony stood between her lawyers, her face showing no emotion as she waited to hear if she would live or die. As to the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant not guilty. Gasps filled the courtroom. Casey's lawyer hugged her as she began to cry. More not guilty verdicts followed for aggravated child abuse and aggravated manslaughter. The jury only found her guilty of 4 minor charges: lying to police officers during the investigation. Outside the courthouse, people who had been following the case for years shouted in anger. Many cried, "Justice for Kaylee," they yelled. On television, news anchors looked shocked as they reported the decision. Social media exploded with angry messages. In homes across America, people who had watched the trial couldn't believe what they were hearing. How could they let her go? A woman outside the courthouse sobbed to reporters. That poor baby was thrown away like trash. Her mother partied while she was missing. How is this justice? The jurors were quickly taken out of the courthouse through back doors for their safety. Later, some would explain their decision. "We didn't say she was innocent," said one female juror. "We just said the state didn't prove she was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. There were too many questions left unanswered." Another juror explained, "We wanted to convict her of something, but the law says if you have reasonable doubt, you must find the person not guilty. We couldn't say for sure how Kaylee died or who was there when it happened." Casey returned to jail to serve a short time for the lying charges. Because she had already spent nearly 3 years in jail waiting for trial, she would be released in just a few days. Officials worried about her safety after release. Death threats against her flooded the internet. Legal experts tried to explain the verdict to an angry public. The prosecution had a strong circumstantial case but no direct evidence. One former judge said on television, "No eyewitnesses saw Casey hurt Kaylee. The cause of death couldn't be determined from the remains." The defense only needed to create reasonable doubt, and they did. Casey's parents left the courtroom without speaking to her. Their family had been torn apart by the trial, especially after the defense accused George of abuse and cover-up. Cindy later released a statement saying, "There are no winners in this case. Kaylee is still gone, and our family is still divided." On July 17, 2011, Casey Anthony walked out of jail shortly after midnight. A large crowd waited outside, some yelling threats, others just wanting to see the woman they had followed in the news for so long. Heavy security surrounded her as she quickly got into a waiting car and disappeared. In the days that followed, anger toward Casey and the jury continued to grow. Jurors received threats and some had to move or change their phone numbers. Restaurants put up signs saying, "Casey Anthony not welcome here." Toy stores donated money to child abuse prevention in Kaylee's name. Casey went into hiding. Her lawyers said she received death threats daily and couldn't live a normal life. They claimed she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and rarely went out in public. A few people who saw her reported she had changed her hair color and wore disguises. The question everyone still asked was, what really happened to Kaylee Anthony? Despite the trial and all its evidence, despite the not guilty verdict, the full truth about how the smiling toddler died and ended up in those woods remained a mystery that haunted America. After her release from jail, Casey Anthony became one of the most hated women in America. She vanished into hiding, moving between safe houses arranged by her legal team. Her attorney Joe Baez later revealed she lived like a hermit, afraid to go outside where someone might recognize her face from the thousands of news stories and angry social media posts. The public's fury showed no signs of cooling. Whenever rumors spread about Casey's location, protesters would gather with signs calling her a baby killer. Restaurants and stores put up signs saying Casey Anthony not welcome here. Several people who looked like her were attacked by strangers who thought they had found the notorious Tot Mom, as television host Nancy Grace had nicknamed her. Casey's parents, George and Cindy Anthony, tried to rebuild their lives in the same house where Kaylee had once played. They faced their own public hatred. Some blamed them for raising Casey. Others believed George had been involved in covering up Kaylee's death, as the defense had claimed. Their marriage nearly fell apart under the strain. In 2011, George attempted suicide, leaving a note saying he had no reason to live. About 6 months after the trial, Casey appeared in a strange video diary that leaked online. With short blonde hair and glasses, she talked about her new life, but never mentioned Kaylee. It's just a little surreal how much things have changed since July and how many things haven't changed, she said, smiling into the camera. I now have something that is mine that I can call mine. The video caused new outrage. How could she seem so happy after everything that happened? Where was her grief for Kaylee? Casey's lawyers claimed the video was stolen and never meant to be public. In 2012, Casey gave her first interview to CNN's Piers Morgan, though she wouldn't appear on camera. I didn't kill my daughter, she said. There's nothing in this world I've ever been more proud of, and there's no one I loved more than my daughter. She claimed many of her problematic behaviors came from trauma after Kaylee's death. I've looked back at some of the interviews I did and I'm ashamed of the person I was. Few believed her. A poll showed that nearly 2/3 of Americans still thought she was guilty of murder. Books about the case became bestsellers, and a TV movie portrayed Casey as cold and calculating. Her name became shorthand for getting away with murder. When someone escaped punishment for a seemingly obvious crime, people would say they pulled a Casey Anthony. The bankruptcy court became the next chapter in Casey's story. In 2013, she declared herself broke, claiming over $800,000 in debts, mostly to her lawyer, the police department, and the IRS. Court papers showed she was living with friends and had no income. During these proceedings, she was forced to appear in public for the first time in over a year. Surrounded by security guards, she kept her head down as people shouted insults. Meanwhile, Kaylee wasn't forgotten. On what would have been her 6th birthday, hundreds gathered to release balloons and light candles in her memory. A memorial was built near where her remains were found, with teddy bears, flowers, and a small cross bearing her name. People left notes saying, "Justice will come someday." Casey's defense team moved on to other high-profile cases, their careers boosted by the stunning victory. But they too faced criticism and threats. Joe Baez wrote a book about the case called Presumed Guilty, claiming the media had unfairly influenced public opinion against Casey. By the 5-year anniversary of her acquittal, Casey Anthony was still in hiding, occasionally spotted but mostly living as a ghost. Some reports claimed she was trying to become a photographer. Others said she worked online to avoid being seen in public. One thing was clear. The trial might have ended, but for Casey Anthony, the punishment of being the most hated woman in America continued, perhaps for life. 10 years after her trial, Casey Anthony remained a name that stirred strong emotions across America. The woman once called Tot Mom by television hosts had lived a mostly hidden life, moving between different cities and using different names to avoid being recognized. But in 2017, Casey broke her silence in a series of interviews with the Associated Press. "I don't give a shit about what anyone thinks about me," she told the reporter in a restaurant where no one recognized her. "I never will. I'm ok with myself. I sleep pretty good at night." She admitted many people still believed she killed Kaylee but claimed again that her daughter had drowned in the family pool. The interviews showed a woman who seemed to have little remorse and felt more like a victim than someone responsible for the tragedy. Casey tried to start a private investigation business in 2020, filing paperwork in Florida for a company called Case Research and Consulting Services. People close to her claimed she wanted to help other women wrongly accused of crimes. The business quickly failed when news of it spread online. "No one will work with a baby killer," one social media comment said, showing the hatred toward her hadn't faded. Her parents, George and Cindy Anthony, continued their difficult journey. They appeared on television shows including Dr. Phil and A&E's Casey Anthony's Parents, The Lie Detector Test. Cindy maintained that Casey was innocent of murder, but responsible for hiding what happened. George continued to deny the defense team's claims that he had abused Casey or helped cover up Kaylee's death. "I would have done anything to save my granddaughter," George said through tears during one interview. "Casey knows what happened to Kaylee. She's the only one who knows what happened." In 2022, Casey finally told her version of events in a documentary called Casey Anthony, Where the Truth Lies. For the first time, she made direct claims that her father George had sexually abused both her and Kaylee. She claimed he had staged Kaylee's drowning to look like murder to hide his crimes. George firmly denied these accusations, calling them painful lies from a troubled young woman. Most experts and viewers found Casey's new story hard to believe. "She's changed her explanations several times," said one former prosecutor who analyzed the documentary. "First it was a nanny, then an accident, now abuse." These shifting stories are typical of someone trying to avoid responsibility. The legal world had changed partly because of the case. Prosecutors became more careful about seeking the death penalty without direct evidence. Jury selection processes were reviewed to account for the effect of heavy media coverage. And several states passed Kaylee's law, making it a felony for a parent not to report a child missing within 24 hours. Kaylee Anthony would have been 16 years old in 2023. No one knows what kind of teenager she might have become, what interests she would have had, what dreams she would have pursued. Her short life ended at just 2 years old, but her story affected laws, changed how people view the justice system, and remains one of America's most discussed criminal cases. For true crime followers, the Casey Anthony case remains fascinating partly because it has no clear ending. Physical evidence suggested Casey was involved in her daughter's death, but reasonable doubt and a masterful defense team saved her from conviction. Her constantly changing stories left a fog around what really happened that summer day in 2008. At Kaylee's memorial, now a permanent granite marker with a teddy bear engraving, people still leave toys and flowers. A worn sign nearby reads, "Justice will come someday." For many, that day never arrived. For others, the case showed how America's justice system worked exactly as designed, requiring proof beyond reasonable doubt, even when emotions ran high and public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Casey Anthony remains free but forever marked by her past, living in the shadows of a country that largely believes she got away with murder.